Objection. This church has a standard of doctrine without error, that is, the Westminster Confession of Faith, which they own as the confession of their faith, and both subscribe it and preach the doctrine therein contained, and so cannot be unsound in their doctrine. Answer. Many in this national church do affirm that both the Church of England and the Independents have standards of doctrine without error. Are they not therefore to be dissented from? And though many of the Church of England's communion be grossly Arminian, and otherwise heterodox, yet many of this church, I say, stand not to maintain that no such thing is asserted in their standard of doctrine, and so judge that that church cannot be justly charged with these tenets, more than this church will allow Arminianism, Socinianism, and Arianism to be looked upon as her doctrine, though 'tis noter that she hath them in her communion, who are maintainers and favorers of these tenets. Furthermore, I still look upon our covenants as the confession of our faith, as well as the Westminster Confession. And if this church abstract the confession of faith from the covenants, I don't see what difference in point of doctrine there is between her and the Independents, or even the bishops of England, upon supposition that the foresaid affirmation holds good. But abstract from this, can this church assign the chapter or section of the Westminster Confession wherein one will find the doctrine of association with malignants, prelatists, papists, or any other known enemies of truth and godliness asserted? I suppose not. That this is her doctrine appears from time to time in praying and praising for such confederacies, so supporting to their power the persons engaged in them, and teaching people so to do. And to this their pleading and lawfulness of the same in their public prints and otherwise. Sure I am, this was neither in doctrine nor practice held by the Church of Scotland in forementioned purer times. And albeit it were granted that the standard of her doctrine is without error, if it can be proven that this church walks contrary to this standard, as seems plain from the preceding accounts, it will not make much for her purpose. Only it says she knows her Lord's will, but endeavors not to do it. Reason 11. Presbyterian dissenters cannot join with this Revolution Church because she is unsound or is guilty of temporizing and men-pleasing in her public worship. This may be thought somewhat strange that a church called Presbyterian should be charged with and dissented from on account of her unsoundness in worship. Though I know none to blame for it but herself, it seems reasonable then that some documents in the charge be produced. I shall therefore begin with one, which is both an additional answer to the former objection and an introduction to the following proofs, such as number 1, though all confederacies and associations with malignants and known enemies to the cause of God be sinful and unlawful, as being contrary to God's express word and our covenants, see famous Gillespie and Binning against associations, see also the Declaration of the General Assembly, July 1648, session 21. Yet this church, both in their King William's, Queen Anne's, and King George's reigns, in imitation and prosecution of their brethren's practice in the bloody period, hath joined in, complied with, defends and pleads for the lawfulness of associations entered into with popish, prelatical, and malignant enemies to true religion and Reformation. This land hath been and is guilty of to this day, and prays for their success and prosperity, though severely threatened and condemned in the word, and not only faithfully declared and witnessed against by both learned and godly ministers and others of the Lord's people, but remarkably punished of the Lord. 2 Chronicles 19 verse 2 with 2 Chronicles 18 verse 3, Isaiah 8 verses 6 through 16. Number 2, this church hath embraced and complied with a set form of words to be expressed in public prayers under Erastian penalties, appointed in the Act of Toleration by the Erastian powers in Parliament for the supreme authority, which compliance with this prescription infers an interpretive subjection to prelacy and homologation of the civil places and power of anti-Christian bishops, sitting and constant members of the British Parliament, issuing forth that and such like mandates, yea, infers a taking instructions and limitations in the ministerial function and matter of divine worship from another head than Christ, and so a yielding to civil powers a directive power in the matter of divine worship, which is no small degree of Erastian usurpation in things sacred, contrary to God's word, to Presbyterian principles, to our solemn covenants, and to the practice and doctrine of our reforming ancestors, and to the Church of Scotland in purer and better times. Furthermore, to pray according to the prescribed form for the present government and governors, all sworn defenders, maintainers, and avowed professors of abjured prelacy, and to censure and depose ministers for non-observance of that form, imply a plain contradiction to Presbyterian principles, and obsequious subjection to Erastianism, disagreeable to the word, and directly repugnant to that petition in our Lord's Prayer, Thy kingdom come. Yea, what seems to border upon blasphemy, to invocate the Lord to bless what he in his word condemns, and what we are by our covenants, national and solemn league, sworn against, that is, a prelatic constitution either in church or state, all very gross corruptions in the worship, condemned by Acts of Assembly 1639, session 23, and Act of Assembly 1641, session 14. Number 3, this church seems unsound in her worship as from her taking of God's name so often in vain, by frequent swearing and repeating the sinful, illimited oaths to, and imposed with penalties by the Erastian powers, such as the oaths of allegiance, assurance, and abjuration in their several editions, the evil, whereof is hinted above. So from her bearing no just, it might be irritating to say, no sort of, testimony against the imposing of state oaths, so flatly repugnant to Presbyterian principles and solemn engagements and superstitions, I had almost said idolatrous, manner of swearing some of them, especially when administered in the exchequer and custom houses, by laying their hand on the Bible and kissing thereof, which idolatrous custom is clearly and solemnly refuted in a late pamphlet called The New Mode of Swearing, etc., printed in 1719. Number 4, this present church, instead of bearing faithful testimony against the encroachments made by the civil powers upon the royalties of Christ, which our reforming forefathers faithfully contended for, have made a surrender of that power she had, and, as would seem, officiously and unsought, for appointing diets and causes of fasts and thanksgivings, when she not only will not or cannot appoint and keep these, but sharply quarrel and censure such as dare not defile their consciences by observing the fasts and thanksgivings which come from the bishops, etc., on the Romish and English holidays, dated from the English popish calendar, lest they should thereby symbolize with Rome and England, as the bulk of this church doth by such observances, that this church hath made the foresaid surrender seems plain. Number 1, from her daily practice, and the 7th Act of Assembly 1710, where, quote, all ministers and members are appointed religiously to observe all fasts and thanksgivings, whether appointed by the church or the supreme magistrate, and the respective judicatories are appointed to take particular notice of the due observance of this, unquote. It is true, they add these 2 words, just and necessary causes, but it is as true their constant practice of observing all diets and causes, framed and authorized by the civil powers, together with bishops, may be constructed to be a just explanation of these words, that all coming from that court are thought just and necessary. Number 2, the Assembly 1722, Act 4, order their synods likewise to record their diligence therein, that all transgressors of the foresaid act may be brought to the Assembly to be judged. Number 3, the Assembly 1723, Act 5, expressly enjoin all synods at their revising presbytery books and at their privy censures to take particular notice if all fasts and thanksgivings have been observed by all the said presbyteries and the several ministers therein, according to the 7th Act of Assembly 1710. Number 4, the Assembly 1726, Act 5, though condescending on some causes superficial enough, yet would not nominate the day for observing the same, but appointed the said causes to be kept on such a day as the king and his bishop should appoint, and enjoined all presbyteries to take care that the said fast be duly observed upon the day appointed by the king. Number 5, this seems further evident from the Synod of Fife's procedure with Mr. James Hogg, who could not observe such days of thanksgivings, etc., appointed by the king, etc., lest he should be guilty of countenancing the Church of England in her symbolizing with the idolatrous Church of Rome in the observation of holidays, and thereby contribute to the hardening of the said Church of England in her superstitions, instead of endeavoring her reformation, as the observers of such days did, from which the synod censuring him and recorded it. Yea, when he gave in a protestation, as was his duty, against the observation of such holy days, coming from such a foundation, asserting the Church's power, to whom it chiefly belonged, to appoint such days of thanksgiving or fastings, they would neither receive nor record it. The Church of Scotland appointed and observed many causes of fasts and thanksgivings betwixt 1638 and 1649, but I cannot find any one of them appointed by the civil government, as may be seen in a collection of these causes printed in 1728, and without doubt it would have been thought very strange in those times of Reformation for the Church of Scotland to have enjoyed an assembly every year and yet for 20 years not to have enjoyed a national fast, as is the very case of this Revolution Church. Considering the manifold sins the land had been lying under all that time, and what new guilt we are daily contracting, such as the solemn and avowed breaking down, ruining, and razing our glorious work of Reformation, and burning our covenants with God, and burying them in silence, except by preaching, writing, and speaking against them, the persecuting and shedding the precious and innocent blood of the Lord's people, for their adhering to our covenanted work of Reformation, the swearing oaths and subscribing bonds contradictory to and inconsistent with these covenants, and, as if once swearing were not provocation enough, magistrates and counselors in boroughs and elsewhere must repeat the profanation of the Lord's name every year by such conscience-debauching qualifications, the establishing a toleration, almost boundless, of all errors, heresies, and superstitions, by proclaiming a liberty to carry on national defection from the Reformation once happily attained to, errors taught and maintenanced which strike at the very foundation of our Christian religion, whereby the bulk of this church is dreadfully corrupted. The gospel liberty of the Lord's people to make choice of their own pastors is trampled on by popish patronages, the Lord's day openly and dreadfully profaned by driving of cattle and carriages, running prohibited goods, reading advertisements and newspapers, blowing post horns and French horns before circuits, bleaching and whitening of cloth, etc., the heinous sin of oppression, covered with the specious pretext of improvement, whereby poor people are squeezed and redacted to most pinching straits, through gentlemen's racking their rents, demanding entries, and depopulating many corners, if not whole parishes, replenishing the same with cattle, etc., as if the Lord had given the earth to black thoughts, and not to the sons of men, which desolating practices, among other things, sadly portends Scotland's desolation. I own, at the first assembly after the Revolution, the Church made an act for a national fast, wherein a particular enumeration of some of the chief steps of defections the land was guilty of in the former period, that is, the declaration against the covenants, the test, and such causes of the Lord's wrath and indignation were insert. I own also that the draft was read in open assembly, and satisfying to many, yet at the same time it had not that relish with the chief managers, who were but temporary Presbyterians, nor with the King's Commissioner, who required that the passing that act might be delayed for that session, and, in the meanwhile, sought up the bill or paper of causes, that he might review it, before any further progress was made, which was accordingly given him, and, before it was returned unto the assembly again, all these particular crying sins of the late times were dashed out, and never one had the confidence to challenge this usurpation, lest thereby they should break squares with the court and politicians of the time. After the paper was restored and read again, and these alterations, or vitiations, it was passed into an act very quickly, lamed and manked as it was. For court parasites did not incline it should be further reasoned on. If this was the way to have the land brought to a humbling sense of their heinous sins, or the Lord's anger turned around, that was and is burning like a flame round about, upon the account of these and other such provocations, I have done with it.